The rain had stopped hours ago, but the sky over Ashford still hung heavy and grey, pressing down on the Tudor-style mansion like a weight no one could lift. Inside the study on the second floor, Eleanor sat motionless in the leather chair that had belonged to her adoptive father, Richard Hastings, watching dust particles drift through the pale afternoon light that filtered through leaded glass windows. Her hands rested on the mahogany desk, fingers tracing the grain of wood worn smooth by decades of his touch, and she could still smell the faint ghost of his cologne mixed with old books and pipe tobacco. The silence in this room felt different now, thicker somehow, as if the air itself knew what she had done. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened computer screen, and for a moment she did not recognize the woman looking back. This stranger with hollow eyes and perfectly styled auburn hair, dressed in a black wool dress that cost more than most people earned in a month. Outside, beyond the manicured lawn and the wrought iron fence, the small town of Ashford carried on with its Tuesday afternoon routine, oblivious to the fact that the man who had built half of it, who had given jobs and scholarships and second chances to hundreds of families over 40 years, was gone. Eleanor had been 7 years old when Richard found her. Not found exactly, but chosen. Plucked from the revolving door of foster homes and temporary placements that had defined her early childhood like a cruel game she could not win. She remembered the day with perfect clarity, even now, 28 years later, the way the social worker had brought her to this very house on a Sunday afternoon in early autumn, the leaves just beginning to turn gold and crimson. Richard had been 52 then, a widower for 3 years, his wife Margaret having died from cancer without leaving him the child they had both desperately wanted. He had not been looking to adopt, or so everyone said. But something about Eleanor had caught his attention during a charity event at the children's home where she had been staying. Perhaps it was the way she sat apart from the other children, reading a book that was far too advanced for her age, her small face serious and concentrated. Perhaps it was the quiet dignity she carried even then, the refusal to beg for attention or affection like some of the others did. Whatever the reason, Richard had made inquiries. And within 6 months, Eleanor Rose Mitchell became Eleanor Rose Hastings, and the little girl who had never had a room of her own suddenly had an entire wing of a mansion and a father who looked at her like she hung the moon. He had raised her with a careful balance of discipline and tenderness, never letting her forget where she came from, but never allowing anyone else to define her by it either. He sent her to the best private schools, hired tutors for subjects she struggled with, attended every school play and piano recital and parent-teacher conference without fail. When she was bullied in middle school by girls whose families had known each other for generations, who whispered that she was just some charity case playing dress-up in designer clothes, Richard had sat with her in this very study and told her that real worth had nothing to do with bloodlines or bank accounts. He told her about his own father, a coal miner who died young from black lung, about how Richard himself had worked 3 jobs to put himself through state college, about building his first company from nothing but ambition and relentless effort. He taught her that kindness was strength, not weakness, and that the mark of true character was what you did when no one was watching. Eleanor had absorbed these lessons like gospel, had built her entire identity around being worthy of the gift he had given her, around proving that his faith in her had not been misplaced. But somewhere along the way, something had shifted. Eleanor could not pinpoint the exact moment when gratitude had begun to feel like burden, when the weight of his expectations had started to suffocate rather than inspire. Perhaps it began in college, when she realized that every friendship she formed was shadowed by questions about her father's money and connections. Perhaps it started when she brought home her first serious boyfriend, a graduate student in literature, and watched Richard's polite skepticism erode into thinly veiled disapproval that ended the relationship within months. Or maybe it crystallized later, after she had gotten her MBA and joined Hastings Industries as a junior executive, and found herself working twice as hard as anyone else just to prove she had not been handed her position through nepotism, even though everyone assumed she had. The other executives treated her with careful courtesy that barely masked their resentment, and she could hear the whispers in the break room, the speculation about when Richard would officially name her as his successor, about whether she actually deserved it, or if she was just riding on the coattails of a lonely old man's sentimentality. Richard himself seemed oblivious to her struggles, or perhaps he simply believed she was strong enough to handle them. He had always seen the best in her, sometimes seeing things that Eleanor herself was not sure existed. He talked about legacy constantly those last few years, about building something that would outlast him, about the responsibility that came with wealth and the importance of stewardship. He introduced her to philanthropic work, bringing her to board meetings for the various foundations and charities he supported, the scholarship fund for foster children, the free clinic he had established on the east side of town, the community center that bore his late wife's name. He spoke about succession planning with the same careful attention he gave to everything else, making it clear without explicitly stating it that he expected Eleanor to carry forward not just his business empire, but his entire philosophy of what money was for. And Eleanor had nodded and smiled and said all the right things while feeling something cold and hard growing in her chest, a knot of resentment she could not untangle no matter how much she tried. She met Victoria Brennan at a fundraising gala 2 years ago, a sharks and champagne affair held at the Grand Hotel downtown, where Ashford's elite gathered to write tax-deductible checks and congratulate themselves on their generosity. Victoria was everything Eleanor had been trained not to be: ruthless, ambitious, unapologetically self-interested, a corporate attorney who had built her career on hostile takeovers and liquidation sales. She was 43, striking rather than beautiful, with sharp cheekbones and silver-streaked black hair she wore in a severe bob that somehow made her look powerful instead of harsh. They had been introduced by a mutual acquaintance, and Victoria had studied Eleanor with cool grey eyes that seemed to see straight through the expensive gown and practice smile to the frustrated, suffocated woman underneath. They talked for hours that night, long after the other guests had left, sitting in the hotel bar while Victoria ordered single malt scotch and Eleanor nursed a glass of wine she barely touched. Victoria asked questions no one else ever asked. Not about Richard or his companies or his legacy, but about Eleanor herself, about what she wanted, what she dreamed about when she allowed herself to dream. That conversation had been the beginning of something Eleanor could not quite name, a friendship that felt more like a conspiracy, an alliance that operated in the spaces between loyalty and betrayal. Victoria became a regular presence in Eleanor's life. Lunches that stretched into afternoons, phone calls that lasted until midnight, weekend trips to the city that Richard never questioned because he trusted his daughter implicitly. And Victoria, with her sharp mind and sharper tongue, had planted seeds of doubt that grew like weeds in the carefully tended garden of Eleanor's gratitude. She pointed out how much of Eleanor's life was still dictated by Richard's expectations, how little freedom she actually had despite all her privileges. She suggested, always carefully and never quite directly, that Eleanor had been groomed not to be a daughter, but to be a custodian, that Richard's generosity came with strings attached that would bind her for the rest of her life. She reminded Eleanor that she was 35 years old and had never made a single major decision without considering how it would reflect on Richard Hastings and his legacy. She began to notice things she had trained herself not to see, the way Richard's philanthropy was always perfectly calculated for maximum public recognition, the way his generosity came with expectations of eternal gratitude, the way he spoke about his charitable work with a pride that seemed less about helping people and more about cementing his own reputation. The truth in Victoria's observations had been like acid, burning away the comfortable narratives Eleanor had constructed about her life. She started to feel trapped by the mansion that had once felt like salvation, suffocated by the weight of designer clothes and luxury cars and a trust fund that came with implicit obligations she had never explicitly agreed to. And Victoria was always there, listening and nodding and occasionally dropping suggestions that sounded like jokes but carried the weight of serious proposals. Suggestions about what Eleanor could do if she actually controlled her own life, about the opportunities that would open up if she were not permanently bound to the Hastings name and all its attendant responsibilities. The illness had come suddenly, or at least it seemed that way to Eleanor, though later she would wonder if there had been signs she had chosen to ignore. Richard had always been robust for his age, still playing tennis twice a week at 80, still putting in full days at the office. But last spring, he began to tire more easily, to lose weight without trying, to sometimes lose his train of thought mid-sentence. The diagnosis was pancreatic cancer, stage 4, already metastasized by the time the doctors found it. The oncologist had been kind, but clear. Months at best, maybe a year if the treatment worked better than expected. Richard had taken the news with the same calm pragmatism he applied to business decisions, immediately arranging his affairs and updating his will with his longtime attorney, David Thornton, a man who had been Richard's friend for over 30 years. Eleanor had expected to feel devastated, had prepared herself for overwhelming grief, but what she actually felt was more complicated and far less noble. There was sadness, certainly, genuine sorrow at the thought of losing the only real parent she had ever known, but there was also something else, something she was deeply ashamed to acknowledge even to herself. Relief. Relief that the weight of his expectations would finally lift. Relief that she would soon be free to make her own choices without the constant awareness of his judgment. Relief that the story of poor little Eleanor, saved by the benevolent millionaire, would finally have an ending that allowed her to start a new chapter entirely of her own making. And underneath even that relief was something darker still, a bitter resentment that he was dying before she had figured out how to tell him she did not want the life he had so carefully planned for her. Victoria's response to the news had been characteristically practical. She showed up at Eleanor's apartment that evening with a bottle of expensive wine and a listening ear. And after Eleanor had cried and raged and confessed all the terrible things she was feeling, Victoria had asked a simple question that changed everything. She asked if Eleanor knew what was in Richard's will. Eleanor had admitted she did not specifically, though she assumed it would leave the bulk of his estate to her, with provisions for his various charitable causes. Victoria had nodded slowly and said something that Eleanor would replay in her mind 1,000 times in the months that followed. She said that assumptions were dangerous things, especially where large fortunes were concerned, and that it might be wise for Eleanor to protect herself and her interests while she still had the chance. What followed was a series of conversations Eleanor could never quite remember in full detail, moments that blurred together in her memory, like scenes from a film she had watched rather than lived. Victoria explaining that she had contacts who could access confidential documents if necessary. Victoria suggesting that knowing what Richard planned to do with his money was not snooping, but simple self-protection. Victoria pointing out that Richard, for all his kindness, had always been a controlling man who believed his money gave him the right to dictate other people's choices, even from beyond the grave. And Eleanor, worn down by grief and guilt and 35 years of grateful obedience, had finally agreed to let Victoria make some discreet inquiries through channels she preferred not to know too much about. The information had come back within a week, delivered in a manila envelope that Victoria handed to Eleanor over coffee at a diner on the edge of town where no one who knew them would likely see. Eleanor had read the summary with shaking hands, her coffee going cold while the breakfast crowd hummed around them with the ordinary sounds of a Thursday morning in Ashford. The will was not at all what she had expected. Yes, there were provisions for charity, substantial ones, but the majority of Richard's fortune, the controlling shares in Hastings Industries, the mansion, the investment portfolio worth hundreds of millions, was not going to Eleanor at all. It was being placed in an irrevocable trust, managed by a board of trustees that included David Thornton and two other men Eleanor barely knew. With Eleanor receiving only a generous but limited annual stipend and the right to live in the mansion until her death, at which point everything would revert to the Richard and Margaret Hastings Foundation. Eleanor had stared at the papers, reading the same paragraphs over and over, unable to process what they meant. She had assumed, had been led to believe through decades of careful grooming, that she was Richard's heir in every meaningful sense. But this document told a different story. It said that Richard had raised her, educated her, loved her even, but that he did not ultimately trust her with the legacy he had built. It said that she was a caretaker, not an owner, a steward rather than an inheritor. It said that even after his death, Richard would control her life through the mechanisms of trusts and boards and conditions, ensuring that she could never stray too far from the path he had laid out for her. The betrayal of it had been staggering, not because she had ever really wanted his money for its own sake, but because it revealed the fundamental inequality at the heart of their relationship. He had saved her, yes, but he had never truly seen her as his equal, had never believed she was capable of making her own choices about his legacy without his hand, from beyond the grave, guiding every decision. Victoria had watched her process this information with sympathetic eyes that held a glint of something harder underneath. She had said that Eleanor deserved better, that after everything she had sacrificed, all the years of being the perfect, grateful daughter, she had earned the right to actual autonomy rather than a generous allowance and a lifetime sentence as curator of someone else's dream. And then, very carefully, Victoria had suggested that there might be another way, a path that would ensure Eleanor actually got what she deserved rather than what Richard's lawyers had decided to give her. She mentioned her own contacts in estate planning, people who specialized in complex family situations and knew how to navigate the gray areas of inheritance law. She talked about the possibility of challenging the will, of raising questions about Richard's mental competence during his illness, of suggesting that a man dying of cancer might not have been in the best state of mind to make such sweeping decisions about the distribution of his fortune. Eleanor had resisted at first, had been horrified by the suggestion that she would betray Richard's trust so completely. But Victoria was patient and persistent, always framing it not as betrayal, but as self-advocacy, not as greed, but as justice. She reminded Eleanor of all the times Richard had controlled her choices, had undermined her relationships, had made her feel like her worth was contingent on her gratitude. She painted a picture of a future where Eleanor would be free to live on her own terms, to use the Hastings fortune in ways that actually aligned with her own values, rather than slavishly following Richard's vision. And slowly, over weeks and then months, as Richard grew weaker and the cancer spread, Eleanor had allowed herself to be convinced. The plan Victoria proposed was elegant in its simplicity. They would not challenge the will directly, not yet, but instead they would begin laying groundwork for a future challenge if it became necessary. This meant gathering evidence that could be used to question Richard's judgment, medical records showing the progression of his illness and the pain medications he was taking, testimony from staff and business associates about moments of confusion or forgetfulness, documentation of decisions he had made during his treatment that might be characterized as erratic or unlike his normal behavior. Victoria had contacts at Hastings Industries who could be persuaded to provide certain information in exchange for promises of future consideration. She knew people who could access Richard's medical files through channels that were not quite legal but difficult to trace. She outlined a strategy that would allow Eleanor to appear the dutiful daughter publicly, while privately building a case that could, if necessary, break the trust and give Eleanor full control of the estate. Eleanor told herself she was just keeping her options open, that gathering information did not mean she would actually use it. But even as she rationalized her actions, she knew she was crossing lines she could never uncross. She provided Victoria with access to the mansion under the guise of helping organize Richard's business papers for the transition. She looked the other way when Victoria spent hours in Richard's study, photographing documents and downloading files from his computer. She failed to mention to Richard when his longtime assistant mentioned that someone had requested copies of board meeting minutes and financial statements from the past 5 years. She became complicit through silence and small actions that accumulated like grains of sand, each one insignificant on its own, but together building into something that would bury the person she had once believed herself to be. Richard, meanwhile, grew frailer with each passing week. The treatments were brutal and ultimately futile, buying him time but not quality of life. He lost weight until his suits hung on him like borrowed clothes, lost his hair to chemotherapy, lost the robust vitality that had always seemed to define him. But he never lost his faith in Eleanor. Even as his body failed, he spoke about the future with complete confidence that she would honor his legacy, would steward the fortune he had built with the same care and vision he had always demonstrated. He told her stories about his life she had never heard before, about the mistakes he had made and the lessons he had learned, clearly intending these conversations as a kind of final education. He introduced her to people who could help her navigate the complexities of running a charitable foundation, gave her books about effective philanthropy and responsible wealth management, treated her like the heir he had chosen, even as his will said something entirely different. If you truly want to build connection with your viewers and want more stories that touch the heart and challenge the mind, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. The guilt Eleanor felt during those months was crushing, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe sometimes. She would sit by his bedside reading to him when he was too weak to hold a book himself, would hold his hand while he slept, would listen to his rambling stories about her childhood and feel like she was being split in two. Part of her wanted to confess everything, to tell him about Victoria and the copied documents and the plans they had made. Part of her wanted to beg his forgiveness and burn every piece of evidence they had collected. But another part, the part that Victoria had carefully cultivated, remained angry and resentful, convinced that Richard's will was a final act of control that deserved to be contested, that Eleanor's years of devotion had earned her the right to make her own choices about the fortune that bore the Hastings name. The end came on a Tuesday morning in late February, the sky pale and colorless through the bedroom windows. Eleanor had been sleeping in the chair by his bed for 3 nights running, the hospice nurse gently suggesting that it would be soon, that she should prepare herself. Richard had been unconscious for most of the previous day, his breathing shallow and irregular, his hand cool in hers. She had dozed off sometime around 4 in the morning, exhausted and emotionally numb, and when she woke an hour later to pale dawn light, he was gone. Just like that. No final words, no dramatic deathbed scene, just the absence of breath and the profound stillness of a body that no longer held a life. Eleanor had sat there for a long time, holding his hand, feeling nothing at all. The hospice nurse had come in eventually, had checked for vital signs with professional gentleness, had made the phone calls that needed to be made. People began to arrive. David Thornton, looking older than his 70 years, key executives from Hastings Industries, the pastor from the church Richard had attended faithfully for decades, They offered condolences that Eleanor received like someone playing a role in a play, saying the right things, but feeling completely disconnected from the performance. Victoria called within hours of the death, expressing sympathy and asking if Eleanor needed anything, and Eleanor had said no, even though what she needed was to turn back time and undo every choice that had led her to this moment. The funeral was held 4 days later at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, the same church where Richard and Margaret had been married 43 years earlier. The service was beautiful and dignified, exactly as Richard would have wanted, filled with hundreds of people whose lives he had touched in one way or another. Former employees spoke about his fairness and generosity. Scholarship recipients testified to opportunities he had provided. Community leaders praised his vision and philanthropy. Eleanor sat in the front pew, dressed in black, accepting sympathy and condolences from an endless stream of mourners who told her how proud Richard had been of her, how often he had talked about what a remarkable woman she had become. Each word was a knife, each kind sentiment a reminder of what she had done and what she was still planning to do. The will reading was scheduled for the following Monday, a formal affair in David Thornton's office conference room. Eleanor arrived exactly on time, wearing a navy suit and pearl earrings Richard had given her for her 30th birthday. David greeted her with genuine warmth and obvious grief, having lost not just a client, but a close friend. The other trustees were there as well. Gerald Morrison, who had served on the board of Hastings Industries for 20 years, and Patricia Chen, an estate planning specialist Richard had brought in specifically for this trust. They all treated Eleanor with kindness and respect, completely unaware that she had already seen the document they were about to read, that she had spent months preparing to challenge its provisions. David read through the will slowly and clearly, his voice steady despite the emotion Eleanor could see in his eyes. He outlined the charitable bequests, the provisions for long-time employees, the establishment of the trust that would control the bulk of Richard's fortune. He explained that Eleanor would receive an annual distribution of $5 million for life, that she could remain in the mansion as long as she wished, that she would have a voice in the foundation's decisions through her position on the advisory board. It was generous by any objective measure, enough money to live extremely comfortably for the rest of her life without ever working another day. But it was not control. It was not freedom. It was a gilded cage, beautiful and comfortable, but a cage nonetheless. What David read next, however, was not in the document Victoria's contacts had provided. There was a personal letter, Richard had explained, to be read aloud only after the formal provisions of the will. David pulled out a sealed envelope, his hands trembling slightly as he broke the wax seal and unfolded pages covered in Richard's distinctive handwriting. And as he began to read, Eleanor felt the floor shift beneath her, felt the entire foundation of her understanding crack and splinter like ice under sudden weight. The letter began with expressions of love, Richard telling Eleanor in his own words what he had shown her through actions all her life. But then it shifted, and David's voice grew thick with emotion as he read Richard's acknowledgement that the structure of his will might feel like rejection or lack of trust. Richard wrote that he knew Eleanor might struggle to understand why he had chosen to establish a trust, rather than simply leaving everything to her directly. And he wanted to explain his reasoning while he still could, wanted her to understand that his decision came from love rather than doubt. He wrote about the burden of great wealth, about how he had watched it corrupt people he cared about, turning them into targets for manipulation and exploitation. He wrote about the pressure she would face from fortune seekers and false friends, about the responsibility that would fall on her shoulders if she suddenly became the sole controller of hundreds of millions of dollars. He wrote that the trust was not meant to limit her, but to protect her, to ensure that she would never have to face those pressures alone, that she would always have wise advisors to help shoulder the weight of decisions that could affect thousands of lives. But it was the next section of the letter that made Eleanor's blood run cold. Richard wrote that he had recently become aware, through sources he preferred not to name, that there were people in her life who might not have her best interests at heart. People who might try to convince her that she deserved more than what his will provided. People who might encourage her to challenge the trust. He did not mention Victoria by name, but the implication was clear and devastating. He wrote that if Eleanor chose to contest the will, if she decided that the provisions he had made were inadequate or unfair, then she was free to do so, and he would not judge her from beyond the grave. But he wanted her to know that such a challenge would break his heart in a way that even death could not, because it would mean that she had never truly understood what he was trying to give her. The final paragraph struck like a hammer. Richard wrote that he had left one provision out of the formal will, one secret that only David and the other trustees knew about, something he wanted Eleanor to discover only after he was gone. He instructed David to take Eleanor to the vault at First National Bank the day after the will reading, where there was a safe deposit box registered in her name that contained something he hoped would help her understand his choices and his love. And if, after seeing what was in that box, she still chose to challenge the will, then he would accept that decision and love her anyway. But he prayed that she would find it in her heart to trust him one final time. The conference room was completely silent when David finished reading. Eleanor sat frozen in her chair, unable to move or speak or even breathe properly. David was crying openly now, not bothering to hide his tears. The other trustees looked uncomfortable, clearly aware they were witnessing something deeply private. And Eleanor felt something inside her shatter irrevocably, a sound like breaking glass that only she could hear. Richard had known. He had known about Victoria, about the plans, about the betrayal Eleanor had been plotting, even while holding his hand as he died. And his response had not been anger or punishment, but rather one more act of faith, one more chance for her to prove herself worthy of the trust he had always placed in her. She stood abruptly, mumbling some excuse about needing air, and fled the conference room before anyone could stop her. She made it to her car before the sobs came, great wrenching sounds that felt like they were tearing her apart from the inside. She sat in the parking garage crying until she had no tears left, until she was empty and hollowed out and so deeply ashamed she wanted to disappear entirely. And when her phone buzzed with a text from Victoria asking how the reading had gone, asking if it was time to move forward with their plans, Eleanor turned off her phone and drove home to the mansion, where Richard's presence still seemed to linger in every room. That night, Eleanor could not sleep. She walked through the house like a ghost, touching objects that had belonged to Richard, remembering moments from her childhood that now felt tainted by what she had done. She stood in his study, where Victoria had copied all those documents, where they had plotted to undermine the will of a dying man who had given Eleanor everything. The shame was physical, a nausea that made her stomach twist and her skin feel clammy. She had betrayed the only person who had ever truly loved her unconditionally, had conspired against him while he was weak and dying, had let a woman she barely knew poison her gratitude into resentment. And the worst part was that Richard had known, had seen what was happening, and instead of confronting her or cutting her off or changing his will to punish her, he had simply left her one more gift, one more chance to choose correctly. The next morning, David called to arrange the trip to the bank. His voice was gentle, but Eleanor could hear the question underneath his words, the uncertainty about whether she was the woman Richard had believed her to be or someone else entirely. They met at First National at 10 o'clock, and the bank manager, a woman named Catherine, who had known Richard for decades, escorted them personally to the vault. She expressed her condolences with genuine warmth, told Eleanor how much Richard had talked about her over the years, how proud he had been of the woman she had become. Each word was another knife twisting in Eleanor's gut. The safe deposit box was larger than Eleanor had expected, a heavy steel container that required 2 keys to open. David produced one from his briefcase, and Catherine retrieved the other from the bank's secure files. They opened the box together in a private viewing room, and Catherine excused herself to give them privacy. David gestured for Eleanor to look inside, his eyes red-rimmed but kind, and she found herself almost afraid to see what Richard had left for her. The box contained 3 items. The first was a thick leather journal, the kind Richard had always used for his personal reflections, worn soft with age and use. The second was a stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, dozens of them, all addressed to Eleanor in Richard's handwriting but never sent. The third was a small velvet box that Eleanor recognized immediately as the one that had held Margaret's engagement ring, a simple but beautiful diamond that Richard had never been able to bring himself to sell or give away after his wife's death. Eleanor reached for the journal first, her hands shaking so badly she could barely open it. The first entry was dated 3 days after Richard had brought her home as a 7-year-old child. He wrote about how small she had looked in the guest bedroom, how she had thanked him politely for dinner and asked permission before touching anything, how she had cried silently into her pillow that first night, thinking he could not hear. He wrote about his fear that he would not know how to be a father, that he would fail this little girl who had already been failed by so many adults. He wrote about the moment he decided he loved her, truly loved her, not as a project or a good deed, but as his daughter. It was the 3rd morning, he wrote, when she came downstairs for breakfast and asked if she could help make pancakes, and he realized he wanted to teach her everything, wanted to be there for every moment of her life, wanted to give her all the love and security and opportunity that had been denied to her in those first terrible years. Eleanor read through tears that blurred the words, turning pages that chronicled her entire childhood and adolescence through Richard's eyes. He had written about her first day at private school, about how brave she had been, even though he could see she was terrified. He wrote about the time she brought home a stray dog and asked if they could keep it, and how he had said yes, even though he was allergic, because the hope in her eyes was worth any discomfort. He wrote about her high school graduation, about sitting in the audience, watching her give the valedictorian speech, and feeling a pride so fierce it almost hurt. But scattered throughout the journal were also entries that revealed Richard's own doubts and fears. He worried that he was too controlling, that his love for her came with too many expectations. He questioned whether he was preparing her for independence or binding her to him through obligation and guilt. He wrote about conversations with his therapist, a detail Eleanor had never known about, where he explored his own need to be needed and whether he was projecting his own fears of abandonment onto his relationship with his daughter. One entry, written just 6 months before his diagnosis, stopped Eleanor's breath entirely. Richard wrote about noticing changes in Eleanor, a distance that had not been there before, a guardedness in her conversations. He wrote about meeting Victoria Brennan at a company function and sensing immediately that this woman was dangerous, that she saw Eleanor not as a person but as an opportunity. He wrote about hiring a private investigator, a decision that made him feel sick with guilt and mistrust, but one he felt compelled to make because he could not shake the feeling that Eleanor was being manipulated by someone who did not have her best interests at heart. The investigator's report had confirmed his worst fears. Victoria Brennan was exactly what she appeared to be, a corporate predator with a history of befriending wealthy people in vulnerable positions and helping them make decisions that benefited Victoria financially. She had done it before, 3 times that the investigator could document, convincing clients to challenge family trusts or change estate plans in ways that gave her percentage fees or lucrative consulting contracts. Richard wrote that reading this report had been one of the most painful experiences of his life, not because he was angry at Eleanor, but because he understood exactly how she had been targeted. Victoria had identified Eleanor's vulnerabilities with predatory precision. The imposter syndrome that never quite went away, the resentment about being defined by Richard's generosity, the fear that she would never be seen as her own person. Victoria had offered Eleanor what she most desperately wanted, validation that her feelings were legitimate and that she deserved to break free from Richard's shadow. But instead of confronting Eleanor, instead of exposing Victoria or forbidding the friendship, Richard had chosen a different path. He wrote that he believed Eleanor was strong enough and good enough to see through the manipulation on her own, that she just needed time and space to recognize what was happening. He wrote that confronting her would only drive her further into Victoria's influence, would make her defensive and less likely to think clearly. So he had decided to trust her, to give her room to make mistakes and come to her own realizations, while also taking steps to protect both Eleanor and his legacy from the worst possible outcomes. Eleanor set the journal down and reached for the letters, her vision still blurred with tears. The ribbon came loose easily, and she saw that each envelope was dated, one for every year of her life from age 7 to 35. They were birthday letters, she realized. Letters Richard had written to her on every birthday but never given. Letters that said things he had not known how to say out loud. She opened the most recent one, written just months before his diagnosis, her 35th birthday. The letter was brief, but devastating in its honesty. Richard wrote that he knew she was unhappy, that he could see the restlessness in her even though she tried to hide it. He wrote that he wished he had done things differently, had given her more room to fail and struggle and find her own path instead of smoothing every obstacle from her way. He wrote that he hoped more than anything that she knew his love was not conditional on her gratitude or obedience or willingness to carry forward his legacy. He loved her because she was Eleanor, because she was kind and thoughtful and fiercely intelligent, because she read books to elderly residents at the nursing home on her lunch breaks and never told anyone, because she remembered the birthdays of every assistant and janitor at Hastings Industries, because she was fundamentally good in ways that had nothing to do with his influence or his money. He ended the letter with a paragraph that destroyed what remained of Eleanor's composure. He wrote that if she wanted to walk away from everything he had built, if she wanted to sell the companies and donate the money and change her name and start fresh somewhere new, he would understand and support her choice. He wrote that the trust was not meant to bind her forever, but to protect her until she was ready to decide what she truly wanted. He wrote that his greatest hope was not that she would preserve his legacy, but that she would find happiness and purpose and peace, whatever form that took. The final item in the box was the ring, Margaret's ring, and underneath it was a note in Richard's handwriting. The note explained that Margaret had made him promise on her deathbed that if he ever found someone to love again, whether romantic love or the love of a child, he would give them this ring as a symbol of family and belonging. Richard wrote that he had tried several times over the years to give it to Eleanor, but had always held back because he worried she would feel pressured or obligated. He was leaving it now with instructions that it belonged to her unconditionally, to keep or sell or give away as she saw fit. A symbol that she was family in the truest sense, and that nothing she could do would ever change that fundamental truth. Eleanor picked up the ring with trembling fingers, felt the weight of it, the simple beauty of it, the love it represented. And something inside her that had been twisted and knotted for years finally came loose. She understood, suddenly and completely, what Richard had been trying to tell her all along. The trust was not about control, but about community, not about limiting her choices, but about ensuring she never had to make those choices alone. She thought about Victoria, and the plans they had made, and felt a revulsion so profound it made her physically ill. Victoria had seen Richard's love as a weakness to exploit, had tried to convince Eleanor that protection was control, and that generosity came with sinister strings attached. Victoria had nearly succeeded in turning Eleanor into exactly the kind of person Richard had spent his life trying not to create, entitled, resentful, willing to destroy something beautiful because it came with responsibilities she found inconvenient. David had been watching her quietly, giving her space to process everything in her own time. Now he spoke gently, asking if she was all right, if she needed anything. Eleanor looked at him through tears and asked how long he had known about Victoria, about the investigation, about Richard's awareness of what was happening. David's expression was pained but unsurprised by the question. He said that Richard had shared everything with him, had shown him the investigators' reports, and asked for advice about how to handle the situation. Eleanor asked the question she was most afraid to hear answered. She asked if David thought Richard had died believing she would betray him, believing she would challenge the will and prove Victoria right about her character. David was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. He said that Richard had died hoping, not certain but hoping, that Eleanor would remember who she really was underneath all the resentment and confusion Victoria had cultivated. He said that Richard's final words, spoken the day before he slipped into unconsciousness, had been about Eleanor. He had told David that whatever Eleanor chose to do about the will, whether she honored it or challenged it, David was to make sure she knew that Richard loved her and forgave her and believed in the goodness he had seen in her from the very beginning. The words broke something open in Eleanor, released a torrent of grief and shame and regret that had been building for months. She wept in the sterile bank viewing room, great gasping sobs that came from somewhere deep and primal, mourning not just Richard's death but the time she had wasted resenting his love. The poison Victoria had dripped into her thoughts, the version of herself she had nearly become. David sat with her quietly, offering tissues and patience, and when she finally had no tears left, he asked what she wanted to do next. Eleanor knew exactly what she needed to do. She needed to confront Victoria, needed to end whatever alliance they had formed before it could do any more damage. But more than that, she needed to understand the full extent of what Victoria had planned. She asked David if he still had the investigators' reports, if there were other documents that might show the scope of Victoria's involvement. David nodded slowly and said there was more, much more information that Richard had gathered, but chosen not to share while he was alive, because he wanted Eleanor to come to her own conclusions. They drove from the bank to David's office, a small suite in a converted Victorian house on Maple Street where he had practiced law for 40 years. His assistant was out to lunch, so they had privacy as David unlocked his personal filing cabinet and withdrew a thick folder labeled simply with Eleanor's name. Inside were months of surveillance reports, financial analyses, communication transcripts that Victoria's associates had carelessly left unencrypted, meeting notes from strategy sessions where they discussed how best to convince Eleanor to challenge the will. Reading through the documents was like watching herself from the outside, seeing how carefully Victoria had orchestrated every conversation, every suggestion, every seed of doubt. There were emails between Victoria and a consultant discussing percentage fees they would earn if Eleanor succeeded in breaking the trust. There were text messages between Victoria and another attorney strategizing about which medical experts they could call to testify about Richard's diminished capacity during his cancer treatment. There was even a draft contract, never signed but fully prepared, outlining the terms under which Eleanor would pay Victoria and her associates a 30% fee of any assets they helped her recover from the trust. The mercenary coldness of it was stunning. Victoria had never cared about Eleanor's happiness or freedom or autonomy. She had seen a lonely, conflicted woman and a fortune worth hundreds of millions, and had calculated exactly how to turn one into access to the other. Every lunch, every late-night phone call, every moment of seeming friendship had been an investment in a potential payout, a long game designed to harvest Eleanor's resentment and turn it into Victoria's profit. But there was something else in the folder, documents Eleanor did not immediately understand. They were financial records from 3 previous estates where Victoria had been involved in will challenges. Cases David had apparently researched as part of his own due diligence. In each case, Victoria had befriended a wealthy person dealing with complex family dynamics, had encouraged them to challenge existing estate plans, and had earned substantial fees from the resulting litigation and settlements. But in 2 of the 3 cases, the person who had hired Victoria ended up worse off than they started. Isolated from family, burned through settlement money, fighting legal battles that dragged on for years. One case in particular made Eleanor's blood run cold. A woman named Jennifer Ashford had hired Victoria to help her challenge her father's will 5 years ago. The legal battle had consumed 3 years and cost Jennifer millions in legal fees. She had ultimately won a partial victory, gaining control of about 40% of the estate, but the fight had destroyed her relationships with her siblings and her father's longtime business partners. Within 2 years of the settlement, Jennifer had made a series of poor investment decisions, lost most of what she had fought for, and ended up filing for bankruptcy. The final document in Jennifer's file was a newspaper obituary from 8 months ago. Jennifer Ashford had died at 41 from an overdose that was ruled accidental, but that David had noted with a question mark in the margin. Eleanor stared at the obituary, seeing her own potential future reflected in this stranger's tragedy. This could have been her. If she had followed Victoria's path, if she had challenged the trust and burned her bridges with David and the other people who genuinely cared about her, she could have ended up just as isolated and self-destructive as Jennifer Ashford. Richard had known this. He had seen the pattern, had understood the danger, and instead of simply cutting Eleanor off or confronting her with accusations, he had protected her with a structure that would survive even her own worst impulses. Eleanor looked up at David, her voice hoarse from crying. She asked him why Richard had not just shown her all of this, why he had let her spiral into resentment and collaboration with Victoria instead of simply presenting the evidence and ending it. David's answer was simple, but profound. He said that Richard could have forced Eleanor to see Victoria's true nature, could have used facts and logic and evidence to prove that she was being manipulated. But that would not have changed the underlying resentment Eleanor felt, would not have addressed the real issue that Victoria had simply exploited rather than created. Richard wanted Eleanor to understand not just that Victoria was untrustworthy, but that Eleanor herself was strong enough and good enough to recognize manipulation and choose differently. The strategy had been risky, David acknowledged, because it relied entirely on Eleanor's fundamental goodness, on the values Richard had tried to instill in her over 28 years. But Richard had believed in her completely, had trusted that when confronted with the truth about Victoria and about his own motivations, Eleanor would make the right choice. Eleanor sat with this understanding for a long time, feeling pieces of herself that had been fragmented, coming back together into something recognizable. She thought about Richard's last words, about his hope that she would remember her own goodness, and she felt simultaneously grateful and devastated that he had never given up on her, even when she had been plotting against him. She thought about Victoria, still waiting to hear the results of the will reading, still expecting Eleanor to move forward with their plans to challenge the trust. And she felt a cold, clear anger building, not the hot resentment Victoria had cultivated, but a righteous fury at having been used and manipulated. She asked David if he would help her with what came next, and he agreed without hesitation. Together, they began to plan how Eleanor would confront Victoria, how she would expose the manipulation and end whatever relationship they had formed. David made a call to someone he described only as a friend in the state attorney general's office, someone who specialized in elder abuse and estate fraud. The conversation was brief but promising. If Eleanor was willing to provide testimony and evidence about Victoria's tactics, there might be grounds for a formal investigation into Victoria's pattern of behavior across multiple estates. It would not be easy, David warned, and it would mean publicly admitting that Eleanor had been complicit in planning to challenge Richard's will. It would mean facing scrutiny and judgment from the community that had watched Richard raise her. But it would also mean protecting other people from Victoria's manipulation, and it would mean honoring Richard's faith in her by choosing integrity over self-protection. Eleanor did not hesitate. She told David to arrange a meeting with the Attorney General's office to provide whatever evidence was necessary to move forward with the investigation. And then she pulled out her phone, turned it back on for the first time since the will reading, and looked at the string of messages from Victoria. The most recent one, sent just an hour ago, asked when they could meet to discuss next steps, reminded Eleanor that time was critical for establishing grounds to challenge the will. Eleanor typed out a response, her fingers steady and certain for the first time in months. She wrote that they needed to meet tonight, that there were developments Victoria needed to know about, that Eleanor had made some decisions about how to proceed. She suggested they meet at the mansion in Richard's study at 8 o'clock. Victoria's response came back almost immediately, eager and supportive, confirming the time and saying she looked forward to hearing Eleanor's thoughts. Eleanor stared at the exchange, at the manipulation hidden in Victoria's careful words, at the performance of friendship that masked such calculated self-interest. And she thought about Richard sitting in his study writing journal entries about his fear that he was not a good enough father, about his worry that his love was not enough to protect Eleanor from people who would use her. She thought about him dying with hope rather than certainty, trusting her to find her way back to herself. And she made a silent promise to his memory that she would not just expose Victoria's predation, but would spend the rest of her life honoring the values he had tried to teach her. David watched her with an expression that was equal parts pride and relief. He asked if she was certain about confronting Victoria tonight, if she would not rather have legal representation present or at least more time to prepare. But Eleanor shook her head. She had spent months letting Victoria dictate the terms of their relationship. It was time to take back her own narrative, to speak her own truth, to stop being the confused, resentful woman Victoria had tried to create, and become instead the woman Richard had always believed she could be. She left David's office as afternoon shadows were stretching across Maple Street, got in her car, and drove not to the mansion, but to the cemetery where Richard had been buried just days earlier. His grave was still covered in flowers from the funeral, arrangements from companies and charities and individuals whose lives he had touched. Eleanor knelt in the grass beside the freshly turned earth, not caring that the damp was soaking through her expensive pants. She spoke to him out loud, told him everything she should have said while he was alive. She apologized for the resentment, for the plotting, for allowing Victoria to poison her gratitude into obligation. She thanked him for the journal, for the letters, for trusting her enough to leave her one last chance to choose correctly. She promised him that she would honor his legacy, not by blindly following his exact wishes, but by applying the values he had taught her, by using the fortune he had built to do genuine good in the world. And she told him about the confrontation planned for that evening, about the investigation she would participate in, about the choice she was making to expose Victoria's manipulation, even though it meant exposing her own failures. She told him that she understood now what the trust really meant, that she was grateful for the protection, even though she had resented it, that she would work with David and the other trustees not as antagonists, but as partners in stewarding the legacy he had built over a lifetime. The sun was setting by the time Eleanor finished speaking, the sky streaked with orange and gold that reminded her of the golden hour light that had filled the mansion during her childhood. She placed one hand on the cold marble headstone, felt the inscription under her fingers, Richard James Hastings, beloved husband and father. The last word still had the power to make her cry, still carried the weight of a gift she had nearly thrown away. She stood, brushed the grass from her knees, and walked back to her car. It was time to face Victoria, time to end the manipulation and begin the work of becoming the woman Richard had believed in. Time to prove that his faith had not been misplaced, that the girl he had saved from the foster system 28 years ago had absorbed his lessons deeply enough to recognize truth from exploitation, love from control, protection from limitation. The drive back to the mansion felt different somehow, the familiar roads taking on new significance. This was her home, not because Richard's money had bought it, but because his love had made it one. And the confrontation waiting for her in Richard's study was not about defending her rights or claiming what she deserved, but about protecting other people from the predation she had nearly fallen victim to, about choosing integrity over ease. Eleanor pulled into the circular driveway as the last light was fading from the sky, the mansion's windows glowing warm against the deepening blue of twilight. Victoria's sleek black sedan was already there, parked near the front entrance, and Eleanor could see a figure moving behind the study window on the second floor. For just a moment, Eleanor felt a flicker of the old uncertainty. But then she remembered the journal entry about her 7th birthday, about Richard's certainty that he loved her, and the uncertainty dissolved into clarity and calm determination. She walked into the house, climbed the stairs to the study where this had all begun, where Victoria had copied documents and Eleanor had looked away, where betrayal had been planned with careful precision. Victoria turned as she entered, a smile on her face that looked genuine, until you knew to look for the calculation behind it. And Eleanor, seeing that smile clearly for perhaps the first time, felt only pity for someone whose life had become so transactional that even friendship was just another form of negotiation. Victoria began to speak, began to ask about the will reading, but Eleanor raised a hand and stopped her mid-sentence. She walked to Richard's desk, sat in the chair that had been his, and looked at Victoria with eyes that were finally clear. And then, in a voice that was steady and certain and completely her own, Eleanor began to speak the truth that would change everything. She said that she knew about the fees Victoria had been planning to collect, about the previous clients Victoria had manipulated and damaged, about the entire predatory strategy that had been designed to turn Eleanor's grief and confusion into Victoria's profit. She said that she had spoken with the Attorney General's office, that there would be an investigation, that Eleanor herself would testify about the manipulation and provide evidence of Victoria's tactics. And she said that whatever friendship they had had was over, irreparably and permanently, because Eleanor finally understood the difference between someone who challenged her out of genuine care and someone who exploited her vulnerabilities for personal gain. Victoria's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, calculation, anger, and finally a cold contempt that revealed the truth of who she had always been. She said that Eleanor was making a mistake, that she would regret turning down the opportunity Victoria had offered her, that the trust was still a cage, no matter how Eleanor chose to rationalize it. She said that Richard had been a controlling man who manipulated Eleanor with love, the same way Victoria supposedly manipulated her with friendship. But Eleanor, anchored by the journal entries and letters and the ring that now sat on her finger, was unmoved by Victoria's final attempt at manipulation. She said that Richard's love had freed her to make her own choices, including the choice to walk away from everything he had built if that was what she truly wanted. While Victoria's friendship had only ever been designed to trap her in a relationship where Victoria held all the power and extracted all the benefit, she said that the trust was not a cage, but a support system, not control, but community, not limitation, but protection against exactly the kind of predation Victoria represented. She stood and walked to the study door, held it open in an unmistakable gesture of dismissal. Victoria gathered her things with a brittle dignity, made one final attempt to suggest that Eleanor was delusional and ungrateful, but her words had lost their power, revealed as the hollow manipulation they had always been, and they bounced off Eleanor like rain off glass. Victoria left without another word, her heels clicking down the stairs and across the marble floor, the sound of the front door closing echoing through the mansion with a finality that felt like freedom. Eleanor stood alone in Richard's study, in the room where so much had happened, where betrayal had been planned and now ended, where the truth had finally emerged from underneath layers of manipulation and resentment and grief. She looked around at the books Richard had loved, the photographs of her childhood that still lined the walls, the desk where he had written journal entries expressing his deepest fears and greatest hopes. And she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, a sense of peace that came from alignment between who she was and who she wanted to be. She walked to the window and looked out over the grounds where she had played as a child, where Richard had taught her to garden and to appreciate the beauty of growing things with patient attention. The moon was rising over the trees, casting silver light across the lawn, and Eleanor made a silent promise to herself and to Richard's memory that she would spend the rest of her life honoring not just his will, but his values, not just preserving what he had built, but using it to create the kind of legacy that would make him proud. Not because she owed him, but because she wanted to, because she finally understood that the greatest gift he had given her was not the mansion or the money or even the opportunities, but the belief that she was worthy of love without conditions, trust without reservations, faith without limits. The morning after Victoria left came slowly, dawn breaking over Ashford with a gentleness that felt almost sacred. Eleanor woke in Richard's study, where she had fallen asleep in his leather chair sometime after midnight, her body stiff, but her mind clearer than it had been in months. Pale gold light filtered through the leaded glass windows, painting geometric patterns across the Persian rug. And for the first time since his death, the silence in this room felt peaceful rather than suffocating. She had spent half the night reading more of the journal, more of the birthday letters, piecing together a portrait of Richard that was more complex and human than the saint she had resented, or the manipulator Victoria had tried to convince her he was. He had been flawed and loving, controlling and generous, afraid and brave, a man who had done his imperfect best to raise a damaged child into a whole person, and who had trusted that his lessons would survive even his own death and her worst mistakes. Eleanor stood and stretched, feeling muscles protest from the awkward sleeping position, and walked to the window that overlooked the back gardens. The roses Richard had planted years ago were just beginning to bud, tight green fists that would open into blooms by summer. He had loved those roses, had tended them himself every weekend despite having a full landscaping staff, had told Eleanor that growing things required patience and attention and the willingness to prune away what no longer served the plant's health. She understood now that he had been talking about more than gardening, that every lesson he taught had layers she was only beginning to recognize. The trust he had established was pruning, cutting away her ability to make certain catastrophic mistakes while leaving room for growth in directions that would sustain rather than destroy her. She showered and dressed in simple clothes, jeans and a sweater that had belonged to her college years, finding comfort in their ordinariness after days of funeral black and business suits. She made coffee in the kitchen where Richard had taught her to cook, remembering Sunday mornings when they would make pancakes together, Richard patiently showing her how to wait for the bubbles to form before flipping, how to know when the heat was too high or too low. Those moments had felt mundane at the time, ordinary domestic rituals that she had sometimes resented for their very ordinariness. But now she saw them for what they had been, a wealthy man choosing to spend his limited time teaching his daughter that there was value in simple competence, that being able to feed yourself was as important as being able to manage a corporate board. David called mid-morning to check on her, his voice warm but careful, clearly uncertain about what frame of mind he would find her in after the confrontation with Victoria. Eleanor told him she was all right. Better than all right, actually, that something had shifted in her during the night. She asked if they could meet later in the week to discuss the trust in detail, not to challenge it, but to understand it fully, to learn how to work within its structure rather than against it. She could hear the relief in David's voice as he agreed, as he told her that Richard would be proud of the choice she was making, that he had always believed she would find her way to this understanding eventually. But Eleanor also told David about a decision she had made in the early hours of the morning, a choice that felt both terrifying and necessary. She wanted to address the community directly, to acknowledge publicly what had happened with Victoria, to own her mistakes before rumors and speculation could twist the narrative into something uglier than the truth. David was quiet for a long moment, then asked if she was certain, reminded her that she had no legal obligation to expose her own failures, that she could simply cooperate with the Attorney General's investigation without making any public statement. But Eleanor was resolute. She said that Richard had taught her that character was what you did when no one was watching, but also that integrity meant taking responsibility when everyone was watching, especially when it was difficult and embarrassing and would invite judgment. They agreed that Eleanor would speak at the next Hastings Foundation board meeting, scheduled for the following week. It would be her first official act as a board member, her first public appearance since Richard's funeral, and she would use it to tell the truth about her near betrayal and her choice to honor Richard's trust despite her initial resentment. It would not be easy, David warned, and some people would judge her harshly for even considering a challenge to Richard's will. But others might see her honesty as evidence of the values Richard had tried to instill, might recognize that acknowledging mistakes was harder and braver than pretending they had never happened. Eleanor spent the next few days preparing, not a speech exactly, but a framework for honesty, an outline of what she needed to say to honor both the truth and Richard's memory. She met with the Attorney General's investigator, a woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in financial exploitation of vulnerable individuals. Sarah was professional but kind, asking detailed questions about Victoria's methods, about the timeline of their relationship, about the specific strategies Victoria had used to cultivate Eleanor's resentment. Eleanor answered every question fully, providing copies of text messages and emails, describing conversations she wished she could forget, painting a picture of manipulation that was both subtle and devastatingly effective. Sarah told her that Victoria had been on their radar for years, but that victims rarely came forward, ashamed of having been manipulated or worried about public exposure of their own poor judgment. Eleanor's willingness to testify, combined with the documentary evidence Richard's investigator had gathered, would likely be enough to build a case that could prevent Victoria from targeting anyone else. There might be criminal charges if they could prove fraud, civil penalties at minimum, possibly disbarment if the State Bar Association found that Victoria had violated professional ethics. It would take time, Sarah warned, months or possibly years. But Eleanor's choice to come forward would almost certainly protect other people from suffering the same exploitation. The board meeting was held in the conference room at Hastings Industries, a space Eleanor had been in hundreds of times, but which felt different now, charged with significance and expectation. The board members arrived promptly at 9, David and Patricia Chen and Gerald Morrison, plus representatives from the major charities Richard had supported, the director of the Scholarship Fund for Foster Children, the administrator of the Free Clinic, the president of the community center. These were people who had worked with Richard for decades, who had loved him and respected him, and built their own missions around his vision. They greeted Eleanor with warmth, but also curiosity, clearly wondering what she wanted to discuss at this emergency meeting she had requested. Eleanor stood at the head of the table, looking at faces that represented so much of Richard's legacy, and felt her carefully prepared framework dissolve into something more raw and immediate. She set aside her notes and spoke from her heart instead, beginning with the simple truth that she had almost betrayed everything Richard had built, that she had conspired to challenge his will, that she had allowed resentment and manipulation to poison her gratitude into something ugly and self-serving. She saw shock ripple through the room, saw some faces harden with judgment while others softened with sympathy. But she continued speaking because stopping would be easier, and she had promised herself she would choose the hard right over the easy wrong. She told them about Victoria, about the calculated exploitation of her vulnerabilities, about the fees and contracts and strategies designed to turn Richard's death into an opportunity for profit. She told them about the investigators' reports Richard had commissioned, about his awareness of what was happening and his choice to trust Eleanor to find her way back to herself, rather than confronting her with evidence. She told them about the journal and the letters and the ring, about the gift Richard had left her that revealed the depth of his love and the breadth of his understanding. And she told them about her choice to honor the trust, not because she had to, but because she wanted to, because she finally understood that the structure Richard had created was protection rather than punishment, community rather than control. She acknowledged that some of them might question whether she deserved to be part of this foundation, might wonder if someone who had been willing to betray Richard's trust could be trusted to uphold his legacy. She said she understood those doubts and would not argue against them, would simply ask for the opportunity to prove through actions rather than words that she had learned from her mistakes, that Richard's faith in her had not been entirely misplaced. When she finished speaking, the room was silent for a long moment. Then Carolyn Mitchell, the director of the Foster Care Scholarship Fund, spoke up. Carolyn was in her 60s, a former social worker who had known Eleanor since childhood, who had in fact been the caseworker who had brought 7-year-old Eleanor to Richard's house that first afternoon. She said that she had watched Eleanor grow up, had seen Richard pour love and resources and attention into raising this wounded child, and had sometimes worried that Eleanor would never be able to accept such unconditional love because her early experiences had taught her that adults always wanted something in return. Carolyn said that what Eleanor had just demonstrated took more courage than most people would ever be required to show, that owning your mistakes publicly was far harder than simply burying them and moving forward quietly. She said that Richard had believed in second chances, in the possibility of redemption, in the idea that people were defined not by their worst moments, but by their willingness to learn and grow from those moments. And she said that if Richard were alive, he would be proud of Eleanor for choosing honesty over self-protection, truth over convenience, integrity over reputation. Others around the table nodded, adding their own perspectives. Marcus Webb, who ran the community center, talked about his own mistakes in his 20s, about the people who had given him second chances when he did not deserve them, about the importance of grace in building strong communities. Patricia pointed out that Eleanor's willingness to cooperate with the Attorney General's investigation showed exactly the kind of ethical commitment that Richard had valued, that protecting others from Victoria's manipulation was more important than protecting her own reputation. Gerald Morrison said that Richard had once told him that he was not raising Eleanor to be perfect, but to be good, and that goodness meant acknowledging when you were wrong and taking steps to make things right. David spoke last, his voice thick with emotion. He said that he had been present for Richard's final conscious moments, had heard Richard's last words about Eleanor, and he wanted to share them now with the board. Richard had said that Eleanor was stronger than she knew, braver than she believed, and loved beyond measure. He said that whatever choices she made, whatever path she chose, he trusted that the values he had tried to teach her would guide her eventually to the right decisions. He said that the trust was not about controlling her, but about loving her enough to protect her from the worst consequences of inevitable mistakes, about believing in her capacity for growth and redemption, even when she stopped believing in herself. Eleanor wept openly as David spoke, not caring who saw or what they thought, grieving the time she had wasted doubting Richard's love and resenting his structure. Several other board members were crying too, moved by David's words and by the raw honesty of Eleanor's confession. And when David finished speaking, Carolyn stood and walked around the table to embrace Eleanor, and others followed, creating a moment of community and forgiveness that felt like a kind of baptism, a washing away of old resentments and the birth of something new and more honest. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor threw herself into foundation work with an intensity that surprised even her. She visited the free clinic and spent a day shadowing Dr. James Patterson, the medical director, learning about the challenges of providing healthcare to uninsured families. The waiting room was crowded with people who looked tired and worried, parents holding sick children, elderly folks with chronic conditions they could not afford to treat anywhere else. Dr. Patterson introduced her to Maria Santos, a single mother of 3 who worked 2 jobs but still could not afford health insurance. Maria's youngest daughter had asthma, a manageable condition if treated properly, but potentially fatal without access to medication and regular monitoring. The clinic had kept the child healthy for 3 years, and Maria told Eleanor with tears in her eyes that Richard had literally saved her daughter's life by ensuring this place existed. Eleanor attended scholarship interviews at the Foster Care Fund and met teenagers whose stories reminded her painfully of her own childhood. Kids who had survived things that should have broken them and who were fighting for opportunities to build better lives. She met Jacob Martinez, 17 years old, who had been in 9 different placements before finally landing with a stable foster family at 15. He wanted to study engineering, had a transcript full of advanced math and science courses despite the chaos of his childhood, had dreams of designing sustainable housing for low-income communities. Eleanor saw herself in his fierce determination, in the way he refused to let his past define his future, and she made a mental note to follow his progress through college and beyond. She helped organize the summer program at the community center, working alongside volunteers to create safe spaces for children whose home lives were chaotic or dangerous. She painted walls and assembled bookshelves and set up computers, working shoulder to shoulder with people from every part of Ashford's community. A woman named Grace Cooper, whose children had attended the center's programs for years, told Eleanor that this place had kept her son out of gangs, had given him mentors and activities, and a sense that someone cared whether he succeeded or failed. She said that Richard had understood something most wealthy people never grasped, that throwing money at problems was easy, but building relationships and community required showing up consistently over time. Each experience deepened Eleanor's understanding of what Richard had been trying to accomplish, helped her see that the fortune he had accumulated was not an end in itself, but a tool for addressing real human needs. She began to recognize people she had met at various events over the years, people whose lives had been changed by Richard's generosity in ways large and small, and she started to understand that the trust structure Richard had created ensured that this work would continue long after his death, protected from the whims or mistakes of any single individual, including Eleanor herself. 6 months after Richard's death, The Attorney General's office filed formal charges against Victoria Brennan. The case included fraud, elder exploitation, and violations of professional ethics across multiple estates over a 10-year period. Eleanor testified at the preliminary hearing, describing Victoria's methods in detail, providing evidence of the calculated manipulation. It was difficult and embarrassing sitting in a courtroom while attorneys dissected her vulnerability and poor judgment. But Eleanor endured it because she knew that her testimony might prevent Victoria from targeting someone else, might save another grieving person from the same exploitation she had nearly fallen victim to. The local newspaper covered the hearing, and Eleanor's testimony became public knowledge in Ashford. The response was mixed. Some people praised her courage in coming forward, her willingness to acknowledge mistakes and work to prevent others from being harmed. Others were judgmental, questioning how she could have been so easily manipulated, suggesting that her near betrayal revealed character flaws that should disqualify her from any role in Richard's foundation. Eleanor read both the praise and criticism with equal attention, accepting both as legitimate responses to her choices, refusing to defend herself beyond the truth she had already spoken. But she also noticed something unexpected. Other people began to reach out, people who had their own stories of manipulation by Victoria or similar predators, people who had been too ashamed to come forward until they saw Eleanor's example. A man named Thomas Garrett contacted her through David's office, explaining that Victoria had befriended his mother during her final illness and convinced her to change her will in ways that had devastated the family. He had been considering coming forward, but had been afraid of the scrutiny and judgment. Eleanor's willingness to testify had given him courage to add his own evidence to the case. Sarah Chen told Eleanor that 3 additional complainants had come forward after the preliminary hearing, each with similar stories of Victoria exploiting grief and family conflict for financial gain. The case that had begun with Eleanor's testimony was expanding into a pattern and practice investigation that could result in serious criminal penalties and would almost certainly result in Victoria's disbarment. Eleanor's choice to speak truthfully, despite personal cost, was creating ripple effects she could never have predicted, protecting people she would never meet from harm they would never know they had avoided. A year after Richard's death, Eleanor organized a memorial service at the community center, not a funeral, but a celebration of his life and legacy. She invited everyone who had been touched by his generosity, scholarship recipients and clinic patients, and community center volunteers, business partners and employees, and casual acquaintances. Hundreds of people came, filling the main hall and spilling out into the gardens, and Eleanor invited anyone who wanted to share a memory or story to speak. The testimonials went on for hours. A young woman named Maya Thornton talked about how the foster care scholarship had allowed her to attend college and become a social worker, breaking a cycle of poverty that had defined her family for generations. Dr. Patterson spoke about patients whose lives had been saved by the free clinic, people who would have died from treatable conditions if Richard had not believed that healthcare was a human right rather than a privilege. Marcus described programs at the community center that kept kids off the streets and gave them alternatives to gangs and drugs, opportunities that existed only because Richard had provided both funding and active support. But it was Carolyn's speech that affected Eleanor most deeply. Carolyn talked about the day she had brought 7-year-old Eleanor to Richard's mansion, about how uncertain she had been that this placement would work, about her fear that Richard was taking on more than he understood. She described watching over the years as Richard poured everything he had into raising this wounded child, how he had called Carolyn regularly in those early years, asking for advice about trauma and attachment, how he had educated himself about foster care and adoption and the long-term effects of early childhood neglect. And then Carolyn said something that made Eleanor weep openly in front of hundreds of people. She said that Richard had told her about 5 years ago, that raising Eleanor had been the greatest accomplishment of his life, more meaningful than building Hastings Industries or accumulating wealth or earning community recognition. He said that everything else he had done felt hollow compared to the privilege of being Eleanor's father, of watching her grow from a frightened 7-year-old into a capable, thoughtful woman. He said that even if she never took over the business, even if she walked away from everything he had built, he would still consider his life a success because he had loved her and been loved by her. Carolyn finished by looking directly at Eleanor and saying that Richard had died believing in her, trusting in her fundamental goodness even when she had doubted it herself, certain that she would eventually find her way to the truth underneath all the confusion and manipulation. He had told Carolyn that Eleanor was his greatest legacy, not the money or the buildings or the foundation, but the woman he had raised to be kind and strong and capable of recognizing love, even when it came wrapped in structure and expectation. Eleanor could not speak for several minutes after Carolyn finished, could only stand at the front of the hall, crying while people who had loved Richard and who were learning to love her waited patiently for her to compose herself. When she finally found her voice, she thanked everyone for coming, for sharing their stories, for being part of the community Richard had built through decades of patient generosity. She said that she was committed to honoring his legacy, not by preserving it unchanged like a museum piece, but by continuing to grow it in ways that served real needs. She announced that the foundation would be expanding its mission in the coming year, adding new programs focused on mental health services for trauma survivors and housing assistance for people aging out of foster care, issues close to her own experience that she believed Richard would have supported enthusiastically. She said that she would be working closely with the trustees and program directors to ensure these expansions were done thoughtfully and sustainably, that she was not trying to impose her own vision, but rather to extend Richard's vision into areas he might not have considered but would have embraced if he had understood the need. And she ended by reading a paragraph from one of Richard's birthday letters, one she had returned to repeatedly in the months since his death. In the letter written for her 21st birthday, Richard had written that his greatest hope for her was not that she would be successful or wealthy or admired, but that she would be happy and whole and free to become whoever she was meant to be. He wrote that love was not about shaping someone into your image of perfection, but about giving them space and support to discover their own shape, their own perfection, their own path. Eleanor told the assembled crowd that it had taken her far too long to understand what Richard was trying to say in that letter and in the structure of the trust, that she had mistaken protection for control and support for obligation, that she had nearly thrown away the greatest gift she had ever been given because she had been too wounded and too proud to recognize love when it came without conditions. She said that she was still learning, still growing, still making mistakes, but that she was finally doing it with clear eyes and honest intentions, finally trying to become the woman Richard had believed she could be. The memorial service ended with a moment of silence, hundreds of people standing together in the hall Richard had funded, remembering a man who had used his wealth not to accumulate power, but to create opportunity, not to control others, but to lift them toward their own potential. And Eleanor stood among them, feeling something she had not felt since childhood, a sense of belonging that was complete and uncomplicated, a certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, surrounded by people who valued her not for her money or her name, but for her willingness to show up honestly and work alongside them. 3 years after Richard's death, on what would have been his 84th birthday, Eleanor returned to the cemetery with flowers she had grown herself in the garden Richard had taught her to tend. The roses were blooming, deep red and golden yellow, and she cut several stems carefully, remembering his instructions about cutting at an angle to promote new growth. She arranged them in the vase permanently installed at his headstone, then sat in the grass, as she had done so many times before. She told him about the foundation's recent successes, about the 50 new scholarships they had funded that year, about the expansion of the free clinic to include dental services, about the community center's new after-school program for middle schoolers. She told him about Victoria's conviction and 3-year prison sentence, about the restitution she would have to pay to the families she had exploited, about the disbarment that would prevent her from ever practicing law again. And she told him that she finally understood what he had been trying to teach her all along, that love and structure were not opposites but partners, that freedom without support was often just another form of abandonment, that the trust he had established was not a cage but a community, not a limitation but a foundation on which she could build a life that honored both her own needs and his values. She told him that she was grateful, genuinely grateful, without resentment or obligation, for the gift of being raised by someone who had loved her enough to protect her even from herself, who had trusted her enough to give her room to make mistakes, who had believed in her capacity for redemption even when she had stopped believing in it herself. She told him that she wore Margaret's ring every day, that it reminded her she belonged to something larger than herself, that family was not just about blood, but about choice and commitment and the willingness to show up for each other through difficulty and doubt. She told him that she was trying to live in ways that would make him proud, not because she owed him, but because she wanted to. Because his values had become her values, not through obligation, but through understanding. Not through control, but through the slow, patient work of love that persisted even past death. The sun was setting as she finished speaking, the sky turning shades of amber and rose that painted the headstone in warm light. Eleanor stood and placed one hand on the marble, feeling the letters of his name under her fingers. She made a final promise to his memory and to herself. She promised that she would continue the work he had started, not as a burden or obligation, but as a calling, not to preserve his legacy unchanged, but to grow it in ways that served emerging needs. She promised that she would honor the trust he had placed in her by being trustworthy, that she would justify his faith by being faithful, that she would prove his love was not misplaced by loving others with the same patient generosity he had shown her. She promised that she would live not in his shadow, but in his light, not bound by his expectations, but guided by his values, not trapped by gratitude, but freed by understanding. And she promised that when her own time came to pass on what she had been given, she would do it with the same careful attention to protection and possibility, the same balance of structure and freedom, the same deep, abiding faith in the human capacity for growth and redemption that Richard had demonstrated throughout his life, and especially in his death. Eleanor walked back to her car as the first stars began to appear, the ring on her finger catching the last light of day, and she felt a peace that came not from having arrived at some final destination, but from being firmly on a path that led toward becoming. She had learned that redemption was not a single moment, but a series of choices made daily, that transformation happened slowly through accumulated small acts of integrity and courage and love. She had discovered that the greatest gift her father had given her was not the mansion or the money or even the opportunities, but the unshakable belief that she was worthy of love without conditions, capable of goodness despite her mistakes, destined for something meaningful if she could just find the courage to trust in herself the way he had always trusted in her. The lights of Ashford twinkled in the valley below as she drove home through the gathering dusk. Home to the mansion that was no longer a cage but a sanctuary, no longer a museum of someone else's achievements, but a foundation for her own meaningful work. And Eleanor knew, with a certainty that came from hard-won wisdom rather than easy assumption, that Richard's secret will had changed everything not because of what it contained, but because of what it revealed. That love, real love, the kind that lasted beyond death and survived even betrayal, was always about believing in someone's best self, even when they had temporarily forgotten it existed. That was Richard's final gift, his secret will, his greatest legacy. Not the structure of the trust or the fortune it contained, but the unwavering faith that Eleanor would eventually become the woman he had always known she could be, the woman she was finally, gratefully, courageously becoming. And if this story of betrayal and forgiveness, of lost faith found again, of love that refused to give up even when it had every reason to, has touched something in your heart, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. Because stories like Eleanor's remind us all that redemption is always possible, that second chances are gifts we give ourselves when we finally have the courage to accept the love we thought we did not deserve.